France, 1794. Mass crowds gather in Paris, around the infamous symbol of the French Revolution, the guillotine, to see the latest grisly decapitation of an enemy of the state. But unlike the hundreds of aristocrats and political enemies who have been purged over the preceding years, the latest victim of France's reign of terror is one of the architects of the downfall of King Louis XVI and the Bourbon monarchy. None other than Maximilien Robespierre, the latest victim of Madame la Guillotine. The man known to history as Maximilien Robespierre was born in the town of Arras, France, in the province of Artois, on the 6th of May, 1758. His father, François-Maximilien Barthélemy de Robespierre, was a lawyer on the Council of Artois in Arras, the highest court in the province, coming from a long line of lawyers, his family having worked in law since the early 17th century. Maximilien's mother, Jacqueline Marguerite Carrot, came from a less distinguished lineage than his father, being the daughter of the owner of a small brewery, although her family was also situated historically in the Artois region of France. Before he was even born, Maximilien's life was shrouded in controversy, as his mother had been 5 months pregnant with him at the time of her marriage to Francois, and, inevitably, this caused considerable scandal in the conservative town of Arras, which was at that time dominated by the Catholic Church. Indeed, Francois' parents refused to attend the wedding ceremony out of shame for their son's actions. Nevertheless, the couple began a marriage that would see Jacqueline give birth to 4 children, Maximilien Robespierre being the eldest, followed by Charlotte, Henriette, and Augustine. However, on the 16th of July 1764, tragedy struck at the heart of the young family when Jacqueline Robespierre died, just 9 days after delivering her 5th child, who died during the birth, which doubtless was a terrible blow to the Robespierre family, and Maximilien's grieving father soon began abandoning his family for long periods of time, and so, soon after their mother's death, the Robespierre siblings were separated, with Maximilien and his brother Augusta, aged just 6 and 1 respectively, being sent to live with their maternal grandparents at the Carros brewery. Many historians have argued that the tragic circumstances surrounding Maximilien's childhood helped to shape the man he would later become, with the scars of his mother's death and his father's abandonment forging traits such as an intense sensitivity towards treachery and corruption, and indeed, the memoirs of his sister Charlotte depict a dramatic change in Robespierre's character following his mother's death. From a noisy, boisterous, and light-hearted child, Maximilien became serious and hard-working, engaging in only solitary pursuits. By the age of 8, Maximilien had already learned to read and write, and after spending 3 years at the local college in Arras, Robespierre gained a scholarship to the illustrious Collège Louis de Grand in Paris in 1769, and it was here that Maximilien would receive the rest of his education, from the age of 11 to the age of 23. Throughout his education at the Louis le Grand, Robespierre was immersed in classical philosophy, with Cicero's ideas on the juxtaposition of virtues and vices becoming embedded in the young Robespierre, who was devoted to his studies and won numerous prizes at the school as a result of his academic ability and dedication. Indeed, in 1775, Robespierre was chosen out of the 500 pupils of the college to deliver a speech to the young King Louis XVI as he drove through Paris following his coronation at Reims Cathedral. Robespierre graduated from the Louis le Grand in 1781 as a lawyer, and upon leaving the college, Robespierre received a reward of 600 livres for his academic dedication and excellence, a unique honor worth in excess of a year's living allowance. This was a reflection of Maximilien's outstanding abilities as a student, and the sincere belief of the school that Robespierre was a credit to the institution that had formed him. During his formative years, Robespierre developed a great admiration for the Roman virtues, as well as for the work of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as Maximilien became intrigued with Rousseau's concept of a virtuous self, the idea that a man could stand alone accompanied only by his conscience. As well as this, Rousseau's political theory, based on classical republicanism, would have an enormous impact not only on the young Maximilien, but later upon France as a whole. Rousseau was an Enlightenment thinker and author, and his book, The Social Contract, published in 1762, was a text which struck at the heart of contemporary French political structure, where the monarch held absolute power through divine right, the king's power coming directly from the authority of God, whereas Rousseau argued for a system of power whereby the government would attain its legitimacy from the consent of those whom they governed. This central power would then rule according to the general will of society, with citizens owing obedience to this government, which represented their interests. However, such a system could be open to manipulation by an authority, who could define what society's will really was and claim legitimacy by representing it. And so Rousseau's insistence of complete obedience to this representative power, in theory, could allow this authority to enforce its will through violence. And although in his youth, Robespierre's interest in Rousseau resembled more of a personal affinity than a strong intellectual connection, as his political career advanced, Robespierre would become more firmly under the spell of Rousseau's political thought, and this would have immense political and social consequences for France. Robespierre returned to Arras in 1781 and found success as a lawyer, gaining admission to the bar on the 15th of May 1781 and being appointed as a judge in the criminal court in March 1782. But he soon resigned his position due to the early opposition he felt towards the death penalty. As well as this, Maximilien also voiced opposition in his early career towards celibacy of the clergy and also opposed slavery. Robespierre is perhaps most renowned for his determination to represent the poorest in society, as well as for his criticisms of the Ancien Régime, or Old Regime, when arguing his cases, and although his income was modest, Robespierre would reach the intellectual heights of Arras, becoming the director of the Academy of Arras for the year of 1786, and joining the exclusive Rosati Society in 1787, a society composed of other enlightened professionals, like Robespierre, whose networks of ideas and influence pervaded Arras, and this membership helped to heighten Maximilien's intellectual reputation within the province. Although he had gained a good reputation within Arras by 1787, there was nothing to suggest that Maximilien would become anything more than a prominent barrister within Artois' legal establishment. But political change had been brewing in France throughout the 1780s, and in the years following 1787, the simmering tensions that had been growing within France would erupt, utterly transforming the political and social structures of the nation, ending the old regime, and also transforming the life of Maximilien Robespierre. The fiscal structure of Old Regime France consisted of the First and Second Estate, the clergy and nobility respectively, who were virtually exempt from taxation, the revenue of the crown instead being raised from taxes levied on the Third Estate, composed of every French citizen who was not a member of the clergy or nobility, and these fiscal privileges for the top two estates were granted by the crown, in exchange for the support of the powerful social elites, in upholding the monarch's absolute power. However, this political arrangement, which upheld the power of the monarch and the social order of the estates in Old Regime France, was to be undone by the fiscal demands of the crown's foreign policy, as throughout the 18th century, France was embroiled in numerous conflicts, with the wars of the Spanish, Polish, and Austrian succession in the first half of the 18th century, as well as the 7 Years' War and the American Revolutionary War in the second half of the century, placing a great strain on the crown's finances, as the French monarchy fought to protect its claims to European territory and to weaken the power of their great rivals, the Austrian Habsburgs. Facing this fiscal emergency, King Louis XVI attempted to force fiscal and administrative reforms through the Parlement, with the aim of increasing taxes upon all levels of French society, including the first two estates which had historically been exempt from taxation, and as the Parlement, which were composed overwhelmingly of the noble class, were the supreme courts of law in France, they had the power to impede royal edicts by refusing to register them. This caused protracted battles between the monarchy and the Parlement, who claimed to be defending French liberties against the absolute power of the monarch, but in reality, they were acting in their own interests. Amid this gridlock, there were calls from the Parlement and the public to call the Estates General, in order to break the impasse and solve the nation's financial crisis. This was a national body that represented the three estates and had not met since 1614, but the Crown instead called the Assembly of Notables in 1788, a body representing the wealthy landed elites of France, who also resisted reform, as the Parlement had. However, when this failed, Louis XVI was forced, on the 8th of August 1788, to call a meeting of the Estates General to meet in Versailles in May 1789. As a consequence of this political upheaval, Maximilien Robespierre would have the opportunity, in his own words, to quote, articulate the grievances smouldering within him about a political and social system he believed to be fundamentally unjust, and in January 1789, Robespierre began his campaign to gain election to the Estates General. He first released a pamphlet in which he attacked the provincial estates, the regional body composed of the first, second and third estates, which was dominated by the social elites, asserting that all the social problems which plagued Artois were the fault of this corrupt elite. He also argued that the representatives of the Estates General should be elected by the people. In this early pamphlet, Robespierre's two most prominent political ideas are already present. The first of these was his insistence upon representation through elections, and the second was his belief that the poor were deserving claimants of justice in a corrupt world in which they were oppressed by a detached and unrepresentative elite. Traditionally, the estates of Artois selected the representatives of the Estates General. Therefore, Robespierre's attempts to portray himself as a champion of the common people during his campaign and his subsequent estrangement from the political elite of Artois boded badly for his attempted selection. But all of this changed when on the 7th of March 1789, the king announced that Artois must select its representatives through popular election rather than through the provincial estates. Elections for the representatives of the Third Estate in Artois were held in 3 stages, and Robespierre was elected through the first 2 stages to attend the Provincial Assembly on behalf of the Third Estate, the gathering where the representatives who would go on to Versailles were chosen. And throughout this process, Robespierre continued to publish pamphlets with dramatic rhetoric as to the miserable state of the province and the ruling elite whose fault this was, and this helped to gain him support, especially in rural areas where destitution was most widespread. On the 20th of April 1789, more than 1,000 representatives of the 3 estates gathered in Arras, and between the 24th and the 28th of April, 8 Third Estate deputies were elected, with Maximilien being one of them, and so the Estates General of France would convene for the first time in 175 years on the 5th of May, meaning Robespierre would have only a week to prepare for his departure to Versailles, where, in this moment of crisis and upheaval, Robespierre would step out of his provincial backwater and onto the national political stage. Within weeks of his arrival at Versailles, Robespierre had associated himself with a radical faction of deputies known as the Breton Club, who pushed to obtain voting by head in the Estates General rather than voting by order to ensure the Third Estate could not be outvoted by the combination of the clergy and nobility, voting in the interest of themselves and the king. One of the most notable deputies of the Estates General was the clergyman and political writer Abbé Say, who believed, similarly to the Breton Club, that it was essential that the Third Estate must not be dominated by the interests of the first 2 estates. And in a pamphlet published in January 1789, Say argued that the Third Estate was representative of the nation, and thus had a right to reshape the political structure of France independently. And so, from the 11th of May, the representatives of the Third Estate met separately as the Communes, with Say proposing that the members of the First and Second Order join the Third Estate and become a unified body, representative of the nation as a whole. The estates adopted Say's suggestion, and so assumed the authority to represent the nation, and in June 1789, they declared themselves the National Assembly of France, representing 96% of the French population, and Robespierre joined them as a deputy on the 13th of June. Ultimately, Say's intention was to promote change in a passive way and to establish a constitutional monarchy, and even after 1791, when the monarchy seemed to many to be doomed, Say continued to assert his belief in the monarchy, which indicated he had not intended for the revolution to take the course it did. By the 9th of July, the Assembly had moved to Paris and was renamed the National Constituent Assembly, and they began a program of tax and constitutional reforms. But 3 days later, the delegates of the Third Estate arrived at the Versailles Palace to find their meeting chamber locked and, suspicious of a conspiracy to shut down the activities of the new National Assembly, the delegates adjourned to a nearby tennis court and took an oath never to separate until they had created a new constitution for France. Unsurprisingly, Robespierre was a keen supporter of these events and was the 45th signatory of the iconic tennis court oath. The fervour of revolution was in the air, but it was not confined to Versailles, however, as in early July the people of Paris rose up in protest at the replacement of the finance minister, Jacques Necker, with the Baron de Poitou, as well as the rising cost of bread and the gathering of the king's troops around the city, which Parisians feared threatened not just themselves, but also the National Assembly. And so, on the 13th of July, the Assembly declared the formation of a bourgeois militia, and the following day the Marquis de Lafayette was declared their commander-in-chief, who himself renamed it the National Guard, and proposed their symbol of the red and blue colours of Paris, accompanied by the royal white, which was the origin of the French flag. With the revolution now firmly established, on the 14th of July, in a search for weapons, the citizens of Paris stormed the Hôtel des Invalides, a complex of museums where they stole cannons and muskets to use later in the day, when they stormed the imposing symbol of the arbitrary authority and tyranny of the monarchy, the Bastille fortress. The crowd gathered outside the prison, calling for its surrender. 2 representatives were admitted to negotiate, but before an agreement was reached, the crowd outside stormed the outer courtyard of the Bastille, climbing on a roof next to a gate and drawbridge, which fell, crushing one vainqueur de la Bastille, or conqueror of the Bastille as they were known. Then, soldiers from the garrison called for the crowd to withdraw, but in the confusion, their calls were interpreted as a call to enter the building, just as gunfire broke out, which incited the crowd to more extreme violence, feeling they had been trapped, and so any attempts to organise a cessation were ignored. And when reinforcements arrived for Les Vainqueurs, Governor Delaunay ordered a ceasefire and sent out terms to the mob, which were refused, and as he realised his supplies were too limited to last for any significant time, he capitulated, and the crowd swept into the Bastille to liberate it at 5:30 p.m. The crowd seized Delaunay and dragged him to l'Hôtel de Ville, where they discussed what should be done with him. The badly beaten Delaunay shouted, "Enough, let me die," and kicked a pastry cook called Dulé in the groin. It was then that the crowd attacked and repeatedly stabbed him until he died. And whilst some blame Delaunay for the fall of the Bastille, others suggest that the blame lies with the 5,000 Royal Army troops stationed on the Champ de Mars, who failed to respond to the attack. The shocking news that the working people of Paris had stormed a fortress of the king sent shockwaves around the world, and today the 14th of July is celebrated in France as Bastille Day, and widely regarded as the day the French Revolution truly began. Robespierre's reaction to these events was a mixture of shock and joy, and he labelled the Paris protesters as a patriotic army, and believed he was witnessing, quote, "the greatest events the history of mankind can reveal." However, Robespierre's reaction to the more violent aspects of the Paris uprising, the brutal murder of the governor of the Bastille, as well as the mayor of Paris, was foreboding, as Maximilien asserted that the people had exacted justice upon the guilty, and that this violence was acceptable, as a defence of the revolution against its enemies, echoing the rhetoric he would later use to justify the Reign of Terror. In the weeks following the fall of the Bastille, unrest spread across France, with looting and violence widespread throughout the provinces, and on the 4th of August, in order to quell the discontent in the country and prove definitively its leadership of the revolution, the National Assembly decided to formally destroy feudalism in France and legislatively kill the ancient regime. As the Assembly embarked on an all-night session, it abolished seigneurial relations between landlords and tenants, special privileges of the Parlement, and the fiscal privileges of the first 2 estates, and by systematically destroying privilege in France, the National Assembly had completely annihilated the social structures of the old regime and further advanced the revolution. But Robespierre did not play a prominent role in the debates surrounding the August decrees, nor the Declaration of the Rights of Man later that month, only intervening to insist upon the freedom of the press and progressive taxation. On the 4th of October 1789, Paris once again rioted due to a severe bread shortage, and on the 5th of October, a group of 7,000 women marched from Paris to Versailles, an act that became known as the October March, to demand action from the National Assembly and the King. Then, the women's action was joined by revolutionary agitators seeking political reform and a constitutional monarchy, and the mob broke into the Palace of Versailles and rampaged through the king's home, making their demands known to King Louis XVI, killing his royal guards, and insisting the king, the queen Mary Antoinette, and their family and most of the French assembly return with them to Paris. The royal family agreed to return to Paris, and became prisoners of the revolution, in all but name. Inside the Tuileries Palace, the residence of the French monarchs in the capital, their independence was now gone, and power lay in the hands of the revolutionaries, who would initiate reform and install a new balance of power, favouring the common people, displacing the ancient, privileged French aristocracy, with this defining act of the revolution. On the 19th of October, the National Assembly reconvened in Paris to discuss drafting a new constitution for France, and the issue of the king's role in the new French constitution, and Maximilien Robespierre, growing in confidence and stature, asserted his consistently radical agenda by fiercely opposing the granting of a veto to the king, asserting that ultimate sovereignty must reside with the people's representatives in the National Assembly, and though the Assembly did grant Louis XVI a veto, this could only delay legislation rather than scrap it altogether, disappointing the pro-royalist deputies, and by 1790, Robespierre had become an increasingly frequent participator in the debates and the Assembly's leading advocate of democratic principles. Along with opposing the king's veto, Maximilien passionately combated the Assembly's plan to limit the right to vote to so-called active citizens, who paid above a minimum level of taxation, leaving some of the most poor and vulnerable French citizens unable to vote. Furthermore, Robespierre was a strong supporter of a law that allowed people to elect their own local church officials, once again demonstrating his commitment to democratic principles and his belief that every institution should be influenced and shaped by the will of the common people of France, asserting in a speech of the 25th of January 1790 that, quote, all Frenchmen must be admissible to all public positions without any other distinction than that of virtue and talents. Robespierre's reputation was growing, and on the 31st of March 1790, he was elected as president of the Jacobin Club, a radical political group founded in 1789 as an offshoot of the informal Breton Club, whose members were intellectual radicals and self-appointed guardians of the revolution, who met to define the revolution's objectives and analyse the proceedings of the National Assembly. As 1790 progressed, Robespierre's profile grew until he became a national political figure, as demonstrated by his frequent appearances in the French press and the immense number of letters he was receiving from across the country. He also attracted the attention of excluded sectors such as French Protestants, Jews, servants, and actors who felt he spoke for them, and then, in June 1790, he was elected Secretary of the National Assembly. Throughout 1790, Robespierre's support among the radical Parisian masses was considerable, as shown in May 1790 when Maximilien and his friend and political ally Jérôme Pétion were cheered and applauded by an immense Parisian crowd outside the Tuileries Palace following their successful passage of a law blunting the king's foreign policy powers. Then, Robespierre used his ever-increasing influence to spread fear of a plot to destroy the revolution, giving numerous speeches throughout 1790 urging the populace to fear the hidden enemies of the revolution, who were working to restore aristocratic and monarchic power, and though dismissed in much of the press as overcome with paranoia, Robespierre's message resonated widely amongst the people of France. Indeed, this paranoia over the enemies of the revolution was a political obsession that would only intensify within Robespierre. In 1790, Robespierre was also gaining important political allies, no one more so than Louis-Antoine Saint-Just, who, although 9 years Robespierre's junior, sent Maximilien an admiring letter, praising his ability to stand up for the revolution against its enemies, and the two became friends through correspondence, this being the beginning of an important political alliance that would last throughout the short lives of Robespierre and Saint-Just. On the 5th of December 1790, Robespierre gave a speech he was perhaps most remembered for. It was a speech on the National Guard, the police force, independent of the army, and in it he coined the term, quote, liberté, égalité, fraternité, by adding the word fraternité creating the term most synonymous with the French nation to this day. The President of the National Assembly and unofficial leader of the Third Estate, the Comte de Mirabeau, died on the 2nd of April 1791. He had been a moderate in the Assembly, and Mirabeau's oratory genius and charisma helped him gain admiration amongst the deputies of the Assembly and the population at large, and so there was tremendous grief amongst the people of Paris at the news of his death. However, the death of such an influential figure created a political vacuum in the National Assembly and in revolutionary France as a whole, and an opportunity for Robespierre to step into this vacuum as the unofficial leader of the revolution. Robespierre was very active during this time, proposing between May and June that all Frenchmen be declared active citizens, and thus eligible to vote, that the death penalty be abolished, and attacking Abbé Raynal for suggesting the return of the royal prerogative. He also proposed to dismiss officers from the army, whilst on 11th of June he was appointed to public prosecutor in Paris. But L'Ami du Roi, a royalist pamphlet, called Robespierre, quote, a lawyer for bandits, rebels and murderers. Robespierre's position was further strengthened, however, by the events of the 20th of June 1791, with the king's flight to Véran, as agitated by their effective imprisonment in the Tuileries Palace in central Paris, and with Louis XVI still determined to regain what he believed was his God-given right to rule France as an absolute monarch. The royal family attempted to flee Paris for the Franco-Austrian border. Despite making it to within 20 miles of their destination, the king was recognised in the town of Véran, and under orders from the National Assembly, was returned to Paris in disgrace, and the Assembly decreed that the king be suspended from all duties until further notice, and from this point the idea of an abolition of the monarchy and the formation of a republic became a distinct possibility. Robespierre reacted to these events in a speech to the Jacobin Club when he accused all the members of the Assembly who defended the king of being counter-revolutionary traitors on the evening of the 21st of June, denouncing not just the king, but the Assembly which had, earlier that day, defended the actions of the king by claiming that Louis was kidnapped against his will. But when between the 13th and the 15th of July the issues of the restoration of the king and his constitutional rights were debated, Robespierre declared himself neither monarchist nor republican. However, his accusations created a schism within the Jacobins, with 264 members in favour of a constitutional monarchy, leaving to form a moderate political club called the Feuillants, allowing Robespierre to expand his influence over the Jacobins. As with the departure of the moderate deputies, the club became far more radical and aligned with Robespierre's political views. Then, when the Assembly agreed that King Louis XVI should retain his throne if he agreed to the constitution, uproar broke out. The Jacobins led the protest against this proposal on the 17th of July 1791 at the Champ de Mars, where a crowd had gathered to sign a petition drawn up by Jacques-Pierre Brissot, calling for the dethronement of the king. The gathered mob became violent, and then, under the orders of the Marquis de Lafayette, the National Guard attempted to disperse the crowd by firing warning shots, and when these were ignored, the Guard started firing on them, leading to the Champ de Mars massacre, in which between 12 and 50 demonstrators lost their lives. Among those calling for the king's dethronement were Jean-Paul Marat, an inflammatory journalist who, through his periodical, whipped up radical revolutionary sentiment among Parisians and attacked moderate politicians, and yet another involved in calling for Louis's dethronement was Georges Danton, one of the greatest orators of the revolutionary period and president of the Cordelier Club, a populist revolutionary movement named after the Parisian district where it originated, and both of these men would come to be key political allies of Robespierre, sharing his belief in the purity of the revolutionary masses and his fears of anti-revolutionary conspiracies. After the massacre at the Champ de Mars, the authorities ordered numerous arrests, and Robespierre felt unable to return to his lodgings, and so on the suggestion of Laurent Lecroix, he stayed with Maurice Dupleix, a cabinet maker, and after a few days Robespierre decided he would live there permanently, as it was convenient for both the Assembly as well as the meeting place of the Jacobin Club. He may even have become engaged to Dupleix's eldest daughter, Eleanor, at this time. Despite the growing anger towards the royals, the new French constitution was formally accepted on the 3rd of September 1791, and due to a provision proposed by Robespierre, none of the deputies of the Assembly could stand for election into the new Legislative Assembly. Thus, Maximilien was to return to his hometown of Arras. On the final day of the assembly, Robespierre and his friend Pétion emerged on the streets of Paris to a jubilant crowd, who crowned them with wreaths of laurel and led them triumphantly through the streets. Robespierre had emerged as a relentless defender of the rights of the poorest in French society in his years as a deputy, and a consistent radical revolutionary. And his unwavering belief in liberty and equality made him one of the most prominent political figures in the nation, and a man adored by the sans-culottes of Paris, the term given to the militant, working-class patriots of the city. On the 16th of October, Robespierre arrived back in Arras and was given a triumphant reception on the 28th of November at the Jacobin Club, and was given the name the Incorruptible in 1790, which reflected his aversion to bribery and his unwavering commitment to revolutionary principles, which he placed above personal political interests. Indeed, Robespierre developed a purity that marked him out as the primary defender of the revolution. Robespierre spent 46 days in Artois and Picardy before returning to Paris on the 28th of November, and on his travels, Maximilien became convinced that France was woefully underprepared for a potential conflict with Prussia and Austria, whose monarchs had publicly denounced the revolution and were massing troops at the French border. On his return, therefore, Robespierre used his position in the Jacobin Club, where he was immediately made president, to lead an anti-war campaign, as well as continuing to give speeches arousing suspicion of internal enemies, warning against the threat of dictatorship, and promoting trust in the good of the people. King Louis XVI had pinned all his hopes at this time on foreign intervention, hoping that a defeat for France would restore his position as king, and, prompted by the Queen Marie Antoinette, Louis ignored his councillors' advice to implement the Constitution of 1791 and instead began a covert counter-revolution. Meanwhile, Brissault was lauding the possibility of a war, stating in December 1791 that it would boost the nation's economy, and he urged France to declare war against Austria. But Robespierre opposed him, stating neither victory and dictatorship or loss and restoration of the monarchy would be beneficial to France. Despite Robespierre's campaign, the tide of public opinion both in France and the Jacobin Club was turning in favour of a war with Austria and Prussia, to both unite the French people against a common enemy and to defeat what they perceived as an imminent attempt to return Louis XVI to the throne. And so on the 20th of April 1792, France declared war on the Habsburg king Francis II, with Prussia joining on Austria's side in June. The start of the war went badly for the French, losing entire regiments to the enemy in the opening weeks, as soldiers abandoned their generals, and discipline evaporated, and fear of the approaching foreign armies caused political division and factionalism to heighten in Paris, whilst Robespierre, increasingly isolated from former allies, founded his own political journal in May 1792, and used it to attack his rivals. In the ascendancy in 1792 was the faction led by Robespierre's former friend, Jacques Rousseau, who was strongly represented in the Legislative Assembly, and who, in opposition to Robespierre, supported the war with Austria. But 2 months into the war, Robespierre's position towards the conflict changed, as he began to espouse the importance of a war for liberty, with France spreading justice and equality to the oppressed peoples of Europe through conquest. And in advocating this position, Robespierre denounced the French general, the Marquis de Lafayette, an American Revolutionary War veteran who was supportive of the revolution, yet was a strong royalist. With the advancing armies causing fear and paranoia of a royal conspiracy, and with the king's flight to Varennes and the massacre of protesters on the Champ de Mars under the orders of Lafayette still fresh in the memory of Parisians, Robespierre sensed an upcoming insurrection in Paris and hoped that when it came, it would sweep before it the king, his ministry, as well as the Legislative Assembly. Despite his hopes, Robespierre was both afraid and fearful for such an insurrection, and it was therefore Georges Danton, the prominent Parisian politician, who gave the signal to revolt. And on the night of the 9th of August 1792, the 48 sections of Paris formed the insurrectionary Commune and overthrew the municipal government of Paris, storming l'Hôtel de Ville, where it was based. Led by Danton, the insurrectionary Commune then formed an armed mob and stormed the Tuileries Palace, which was heavily guarded on the 10th of August, whilst the royal family hid in the Legislative Assembly. Despite heavy losses, with over 1,000 killed or wounded, the mob, with support from the National Guard, drove out the royal bodyguards from the Tuileries Palace, and the monarch was overthrown. And later that evening, Robespierre rose at the Jacobin Club to proclaim a new beginning for the revolution, like the 1789 fall of the Bastille, but wiser, better and purer, and Maximilien proclaimed to his audience that the spirit of 1789 had been recaptured with the fall of the Tuileries, and that with the downfall of the monarchy at the hands of the people, the revolution had recovered its true course. Robespierre then became closely involved with the politics of his own Paris section, and on the 13th of August, the day the king was officially arrested and imprisoned in the ancient Paris fortress of the Temple, Robespierre was elected to the Paris Commune and fought for its legitimacy against the Legislative Assembly, who sought to shut it down as a rival source of power. But as foreign armies approached even nearer to Paris, chaos and fear began to reign in the streets, leading to the violence known as the September Massacres, where on the 2nd to the 6th of September 1792, the mob that brought down the monarchy, made up of guardsmen, revolutionaries, and sans-culottes, killed over 1,000 prisoners throughout Parisian jails. To satisfy the people's impatience for justice, Robespierre demanded the establishment of a revolutionary tribunal to investigate counter-revolutionary activities. This was achieved, and between the 10th of August and the end of 1792, 28 people were sentenced to the guillotine by the tribunal. Also during this period, there was at last a piece of good news for the French armies, as on the 20th of September they defeated the invading Prussian force at Valmy, effectively saving the revolution, and on the 21st of September the absolute monarchy was formally abolished, and the First French Republic was proclaimed by the National Assembly. Following the fall of the monarchy, Robespierre began electioneering for the new National Convention that was to be formed to draft France's first republican constitution, and Robespierre was top of the list of Paris deputies, elected to the convention, with fellow Parisian radicals, Danton and Marat, also selected, and upon the opening of the convention on the 20th of September, Robespierre and his radical allies sat on the top left seats of the hall, becoming known as the Montagnards, or the Mountain, whilst the rival, more moderate faction became known as the Girondins, led by Maximilien's political rival, Jacques Rousseau. Political warring soon ensued between the two factions, with the Girondins accusing Robespierre of aspiring to be a tyrant, and Maximilien expelling the Girondin deputies from the Jacobin Club, later coming under severe attacks from this faction in the convention. But on the 5th of November, Robespierre rose to deliver one of his most important speeches, defending himself and his reputation, as well as sanctioning the recent violence as indispensable for the advancement of the revolution. The speech was celebrated in the Jacobin Club as a resounding success, and helped to shore up Robespierre's position in the convention, following the attacks from his rivals. On the 13th of November 1792, the fate of King Louis XVI began to be debated by the convention, and in a speech that mesmerized the convention, the 25-year-old deputy from Picardy, Saint-Just, argued that Louis was an enemy of the people, and so must reign or die, and Robespierre followed this 2 weeks later by insisting that, quote, Louis must die because the nation must live. Consequently, on the 14th of January 1793, the convention unanimously found the king guilty of high treason, and on the 17th of January, 361 deputies voted for the execution of Louis, now known simply as Citizen Louis Capet, achieving a majority by a single vote, with Robespierre proclaiming that a great deed had been done, having fought zealously to ensure the execution would take place, and on the 21st of January 1793, Robespierre achieved his ambition, when King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine, the only king of France ever to be executed, although Robespierre was not present at the execution to witness the end of a 1,000-year period of continuous French monarchy. Following Louis's death, the foreign war escalated, with the convention declaring war on Britain and the Dutch Republic on the 31st of January, and within France, royalist and Catholic revolts in the provinces and continued rioting and destitution convinced Danton that the revolution was not yet secure, and he, with Robespierre's backing, called for the re-establishment of the Revolutionary Tribunal, with Robespierre further proposing that capital punishment should be applied to counter-revolutionary acts directed against the Republic, and so the convention agreed to the tribunal on the 10th of March, which consisted of 12 jurors selected by the insurrectionary commune, and there was to be no appeal against its judgments. However, the sending of Marat to the Revolutionary Tribunal upon Girondin orders, where he was acquitted by his Jacobin colleagues on the 13th of April, angered the Parisian sans-culottes, and on the 11th of May, the Paris sections demanded that the convention expel the Girondin deputies, and as the Girondin support resided primarily in the provinces, whilst Robespierre's Montagnards were massively popular within Paris, this gave Robespierre a decided advantage over his rivals, as he could use the force of the Parisian sans-culottes to intimidate and destroy his opponents. So it was that on the 2nd of June 1793, another Parisian insurrection dramatically altered the face of the revolution, once again in Robespierre's favour, when a crowd of Parisian sans-culottes marched into the convention's meeting hall and demanded political and administrative changes, as well as the expulsion of the Girondins, to which the intimidated deputies in the convention agreed, and then the Girondin leaders who had not already fled were arrested. In the aftermath of the fall of the Girondins, the Jacobin deputies drafted a new constitution by the 10th of June, with universal male suffrage and state education for all. But it soon had to be suspended, as by mid-June, 60 of France's 83 departments were in open revolt against the Parisian leadership of the revolution, who were embattled and threatened at home and abroad, and Robespierre, along with Saint-Just, Danton, and Marat, had long believed that the only way to save the revolution was through terror, and within months they would put this belief into practice. On the 27th of July, Robespierre was elected to the 12-member Committee of Public Safety, alongside his ally, Saint-Just. But after ascending to power, Robespierre immediately faced another grave challenge to the revolutionary government. As with food becoming ever more scarce in the capital, news reached Paris on the 2nd of September that counter-revolutionary rebels had surrendered the great naval base at Toulon to the British, and once again, the potent combination of hunger and fear led to a Parisian insurrection, as the sans-culottes took to the streets. It was at this point on the 5th of September, when the convention was again confronted by an angry mob, that terror was declared the order of the day, and in order to protect the revolutionary government, the Revolutionary Tribunal was then expanded, with all jurors to be appointed by the Committee of Public Safety, and on the 9th of September, paramilitary forces were established to take grain from farmers for government use. To fortify this new regime of terror, on the 17th of September, the Law of Suspects was passed, with Robespierre's strong support, allowing anyone who showed themselves to be an enemy of the revolution to be arrested and executed, placing a heavy burden on the prison system. Then, on the 29th of September, price fixing was extended to cover not only grain and bread, but also other essential goods and wages. Furthermore, it was decreed on the 10th of October that, quote, "the provisional government shall be revolutionary until peace." The revolutionary period, known to history as the Terror, had begun, and for 9 months, approximately 16,000 people were condemned to death, with thousands more killed in the repression of revolts in Lyon and the Vendée. And with Robespierre's influence on the Committee of Public Safety, this policy of repression in the provinces had effectively ended the provincial revolt by the end of autumn 1793. One of the 177 people guillotined in Paris between October and the end of 1793 was the Queen, Marie Antoinette, who was executed on the 16th of October, just less than 9 months after her husband. But Robespierre did not pay much attention to the fate of the Queen, as his focus was upon the fate of the Girondins, 21 of whom were put before the tribunal on the 24th of October, and in a rushed trial were declared guilty and guillotined on the 31st of October. With the execution of the Girondins, Robespierre had not just eliminated a rival ideology, supporting a federal political structure in France to weaken the influence of Paris, but in their leader, Brisson, he had eliminated a bitter political rival, with whom mutual hatred had been shared since their clashes over the war. The work of the National Convention continued, and on the 4th of February 1794, it decreed the abolition of slavery in France and its colonies, and the following day, Robespierre's vision for the country, once in government, was laid out in a significant speech given to the National Convention, in which he argued for the development of a society of virtuous individuals, uncorrupted and patriotic, where frivolous activities were shunned in favour of honourable pursuits. And to achieve this, he insisted that terror was essential, as, quote, "without terror, virtue has no power." On the 26th of February and the 3rd of March, Saint-Just had proposed the Ventos Decrees, which sanctioned the confiscation of the property of exiles, as well as those who opposed the revolution. However, Robespierre could still not escape from factional warfare, as divisions had emerged within the Jacobin Club, and the extreme revolutionary, Jacques-René Hébert, who was prominent within the Paris Commune and drew support from the most radical revolutionaries in Paris, clashed bitterly with Robespierre over religion, as Maximilien denounced his militant atheism. In contrast, on the other side of the spectrum were the moderates, calling for an end to the bloody terror, led, surprisingly, by Georges Danton, who, despite being one of the terror's original architects, had since retracted his support. Hébert and his radical Jacobin faction declared an insurrection to overthrow Robespierre on the 4th of March 1794 and attempted to rally the people of Paris to their cause. But Robespierre remained popular among the sans-culottes, and when the revolution failed to materialize, Maximilien saw his opportunity to strike against this faction and took it, denouncing Hébert, who was arrested and accused of complicity with foreign powers, and along with 18 of his allies was guillotined on the 24th of March. With the Parisian extremists' fall, Robespierre was able to greatly enhance his power, remodeling the Paris Commune and the National Guard by filling it with allies, cementing his control over the incredibly influential city, whose mobs had so often determined the fate of the revolution. And with one rival faction of the Jacobin Club eliminated, it was Georges Danton and his moderate faction who were now vulnerable to Robespierre's montagnards. Following Hébert's demise, Danton made a speech announcing the end of the Terror, which Robespierre interpreted as an attempt to seize the leadership in a post-terror government, and so to put a stop to this threat, Danton was arrested on charges of conspiracy, theft, and corruption. The trial of Danton and his allies began on the 2nd of April and was cut short when Saint-Just passed a law in the Convention banning certain prisoners from pleading their cases before the tribunal, despite the vocal protests of Danton. And so, on the 5th of April, Georges Danton and his allies were guillotined, and, as with the death of King Louis XVI, Robespierre was not present to watch the execution of his former revolutionary ally. Consumed with the issue of punishment, Robespierre supported Saint-Just's recommendations to the Convention 10 days after Danton's death of tightening police laws, and so all foreigners or ex-nobles were expelled from the capital, and all political trials were to be held in Paris. Then, on the 7th of May, Robespierre turned his attention to the matter of religion. As rather unusually for a radical revolutionary, he was a staunch opponent of atheism. In a speech, Robespierre insisted on the existence of a god and an afterlife, arguing that a public religion was essential for the good of the revolution and for the development of a virtuous society. Indeed, Robespierre proposed a new public religion, approved by the Convention that same day, the worship of the Supreme Being, and by creating a religion for France, Robespierre was attempting to impose his own values, the values he believed made up a virtuous society, such as the honour of poverty, and a traditional family life, onto the nation with a belief in God at its heart. On the 8th of June, the first festival of the Supreme Being was held in Paris, and Robespierre's recent election as president of the Convention meant that he would officiate at the inaugural ceremony, where 500,000 Parisians gathered to witness Robespierre set fire to a statue of atheism. And as the celebrations continued on the Champ de Mars, it appeared to Robespierre that the excitement and optimism of the early revolutionary years had been revived. Even as the festivals were held, the terror was becoming ever more extreme, and the day following the ceremony, Robespierre drew up laws to invent a new category of criminals, known as enemies of the people. This included anyone who spoke ill of patriotism or discredited the National Convention, among other vague offences, and the punishment for being found an enemy of the people was death. In addition, the new laws deprived the accused of any form of defence, leaving the French people at the mercy of the Committee of Public Safety. From the 10th of June 1794 to Robespierre's fall on the 27th of July 1794, the terror reached its height, with 1,376 people guillotined in Paris due to the law proposed by Georges Couthon, which simplified the judicial process and so speeded up the work of the Revolutionary Tribunal, resulting in this period of the Revolution becoming known as the Great Terror. The French military victory at the Battle of Fleurus on the 26th of June 1794 would mark a turning point in the revolution, as the French Republican forces, led by General Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, would defeat the coalition forces of Britain, Hanover, the Dutch Republic, and the Habsburg monarchy in the most significant battle of the French Revolutionary Wars, as the victory undermined the argument that the Reign of Terror was necessary because of the military threat to France's existence, and could arguably have been one of the reasons for the subsequent Thermidorian reaction a month later. During the month of July, however, a series of actions by Robespierre angered his enemies. These included his outburst on the 1st of July that there was a conspiracy against him, leading to the exclusion of various members of the Jacobin Club, and his insistence that the Committee of General Security should remain subordinate to the Committee of Public Safety. Later in the month of July, Robespierre withdrew from the Committee of Public Safety, which was riven with factional divisions, and he focused most of his work as the head of the police bureau, where Maximilien reviewed the reports flooding in from across France of anti-revolutionary behaviour, and made decisions as to the severity of the crime and the nature of the punishment required. Then, on the 26th of July, the Incorruptible delivered what would be his final speech to the convention, and for 2 hours, Robespierre defended himself and his reputation in a rambling, disjointed speech against the hail of accusations he had received in the past months and years. In the speech, he asserted that his enemies blamed all of the failings of the revolution on him, both its excesses and its shortcomings, and he defended himself against accusations of both tyranny and dictatorship. The Incorruptible stated that, just like the revolution itself, he had remained virtuous and pure, and had risen above the various factions that had attempted to destroy him and lay claim to the revolution. Robespierre also asserted that the time had almost come to move against the latest set of conspirators, but he refused to mention them by name, merely alluding to the traitors in his speech. This caused a wave of fear and anxiety throughout the convention, as every deputy became terrified that they were the enemies of Robespierre, and this dread saw the convention and the Committee of Public Safety form a hostile response to Robespierre's speech. Then, in contrast, the ever-faithful Jacobin Club rallied to Robespierre, driving 2 hostile members of the Committee of Public Safety from the club, and Robespierre's greatest political ally, Saint-Just, remained loyal to Maximilien, despite favouring a policy of compromise with the committee. The 27th of July 1794, according to the French Republican calendar, was 9 Thermidor Year 2, and this was the origin of the name Thermidorian Reaction, given to the concerted attack on Robespierre and his fellow revolutionaries in the National Convention, which began on that date, when Robespierre and Saint-Just entered a hostile convention, where Robespierre's enemies and moderates, who had turned against him after his speech the previous day, were determined to overthrow the Incorruptible. Collot d'Herbois, a Robespierre enemy, expelled from the Jacobins the previous day, was the presiding president of the convention, and was determined to stop Robespierre and Saint-Just from speaking, and as Saint-Just began his speech, he was interrupted by deputies. And as Robespierre attempted to intervene, he was drowned out by chants of "Down with the tyrant, arrest him," which echoed around the convention, and so Maximilien was unable to make himself heard above the din of the hostile deputies. And in the midst of the chaos, the convention voted to arrest Robespierre, Saint-Just, and their 3 allies. The Paris Commune then sent troops in an attempt at insurrection in support of Robespierre, and the prisons of Paris refused to harbour the Incorruptible, who took refuge in the Hôtel de Ville. However, only 13 of Paris's 48 sections sent men to fight in support, and in the early hours of the 28th of July, soldiers sent by the convention broke into the Hôtel de Ville and arrested Robespierre and his allies, and as the convention had declared them outlaws, they could be executed within 24 hours with no trial. During his arrest, Robespierre's jaw was shot, either by a gendarme named Murder or in a failed suicide attempt, and Robespierre was carried back to the Committee of Public Safety, where his shattered jaw was bandaged, and later that morning, Robespierre and his allies stood before the Revolutionary Tribunal and were found guilty and put into carts to be taken to the guillotine. And then on the afternoon of the 28th of July 1794, the Incorruptible was executed, and so, with this final act, the revolution had now consumed its most prominent child, and the Reign of Terror was over. Following his execution, the convention declared France as saved from the tyrant, and the Jacobins denounced their most esteemed member as a despot who had deceived them with his words, and France welcomed the overthrow of Robespierre as symbolizing the end of mass executions, and they rushed to denounce what they now called Robespierre's terror. Maximilien Robespierre was vilified in the decades following his death, with all the crimes and excesses of the Reign of Terror attributed to him, and as a figure that had so effectively embodied the revolution in life, so the bloody costs of the revolution were also symbolized by the Incorruptible, who became effectively a scapegoat for the guilt that was felt by the many hundreds of people who had encouraged and participated in the Reign of Terror. By the 20th century, many more positive views on Robespierre became common among historians, who acknowledged his unwavering belief in the democratic and egalitarian principles of the early revolution. as well as recognizing his total dedication to his principles, rising above corruption or narrow political interests. But many of these portrayals neglect to take into account Robespierre's undoubtedly prominent role in the persecution of political rivals and the Reign of Terror itself. The dominant perception of the incorruptible is of a man who held admirable principles, yet drove them to terrible ends, and in many ways, the life of Maximilien Robespierre is a reflection of the event which shaped him and his age, the French Revolution. And at heart, both were driven by laudable principles, yet the ferocity with which these principles were pursued led France to endure a bloody reign of terror, and whether or not these principles were worth their immense cost is at the core of the controversy that surrounds Robespierre and the Revolution. What do you think about Maximilien Robespierre? Was he a revolutionary tyrant or a revolutionary hero? Let us know in the comments section, and until next time, thank you very much for watching.